Can everybody hear me without a mic? All right. I've only seen this in the movies where I feel like I'm gonna like lean on the board and get the chalk all over my jacket. Does that actually happen? Yes, sir. All right, so I'm okay. So I'll keep these opening remarks relatively brief because I think it's always more interesting and fun if we can actually talk to and engage with each other. Unless you're calling into my show, in which case I keep the calls in. So I want to hit on three themes. I'll talk a little bit about myself and how I came to be where I am. Briefly, it might be interesting. What this book is about and how it fits into the larger project. And I guess I will make a few-minute case for the candidate that I strongly prefer in this election cycle. So I have a pretty unusual background in some ways, which I guess is appropriate for unusual times. My parents were hippies, and they left New York when I was very little. They were totally broke, to be honest, and we sort of fled to Massachusetts in the kind of middle of nowhere, and it felt like the middle of nowhere. It's not actual middle of nowhere, but that's what I thought as a little kid. Like, why the, did I swear? Why the fuck are we leaving New York? This is so boring. And they were very influenced by the counterculture. And I was homeschooled, and it was very self-directed. So I won't get too much into that. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to going that route. But one advantage I did have was I was able to do a lot of reading and a lot of very self-directed reading in any area that interested me. And I happen to be very particularly interested in, when I was middle school, teenage age, I got very entranced with politics, specifically movements in the 60s around civil rights and how they connected to global rights. And that led to my interest in international relations, Latin America, and so on. I ended up going to Bates College and studied international relations, and I spent time in the Middle East and studied in Turkey and studied the relationship between the European Union and Turkey. And then I worked in brand strategy and taught meditation for a minute to try to make my parents happy, and was unemployed because this was after 2008 financial crash. And I ended up getting a job as a producer on a show called The Majority Report, which when I started, I thought honestly I would do for a year and then I would bag it and go to graduate school. And then I started subbing on the show and hosting, and I realized this is what I'd like to do. I never thought I could do it. I never thought there was any path to making a living in media, let alone in television hosting. I didn't have the resources to go do a bunch of summer internships. I didn't even know how one did this. You know, I'd look at like Chris Matthews on TV and I'd be like, where did this come from? How does one do this? You sit around, Capitol Hill and beg people for internships, and I guess a couple decades later, you're literally perched on TV talking nonsense. A lot of opinions. So I launched my own show a couple of years ago, and I focus a lot on international affairs. And I definitely would call myself and am a democratic socialist, which is a trendy term now. And we try to actually bridge that with some very, very important kind of Marxist frame for understanding the world. It's an interesting dynamic because I think these ideas are really important and the moment is super opportune, and at the same time I also, I want us to be what we call sometimes the pre-mainstream, right? I don't want to be in the margins. I want us to win. I think we have the best program. So I'm not interested in being on the outside protesting. That's important. But I want us to actually implement. And I want us to communicate with as broad a variety of people as possible. If you do online politics, especially a couple of years ago, you all of a sudden encountered this group of twerps. I guess, hey, wait, does the civility principle not apply to the speaker? I'm just kidding. I love everybody. But I don't like everybody, but I try to love everybody, right? And they called themselves the intellectual dark web, this group of twerps. And what I noticed was that, one, it was a lot of hiding of the ball. Most of these things were just traditional conservative and I want to be really clear. When I say conservative, guys, I don't just mean Republican, I mean conservative. How many people are familiar with the New Republic in the 1990s? Not today. 1990s, 1980s New Republic? No reason you should be. That means you guys are all having great college lives, and I encourage that. But in the 1990s, the New Republic, and the 1980s, they used to say it was considered to be somewhat liberal, but the line that they would say was that it was even the New Republic was the joke. And that was because they always would find a way to either support Reagan administration foreign policy, or demonize African Americans, or wage a war on poor people. But it was always, I mean, look, we're not one of these conservatives. We're not like that. We're enlightened liberals. Here's why we have to do what all the conservatives want. And so the IDW struck me as very much in that vein. And so I did videos, and I debunked, and I had to listen to Sam Harris kind of drearily talk about Islam, and and Jordan Peterson has this. Yeah. For a guy who talks a lot about like traditional gender roles and whatnot, why does he sound like a 50s housewife? I mean, we're here, in Brooklyn, being like, yeah, we're socialists and support transgender rights, but we're not crying every 2 seconds. So this is a little trying to present what happens on the show. So we did that content, and Dave Rubin was, I mean, come on, right? It's just, I almost feel bad at this point. He was just this kind of like, I don't know how many of you are familiar, I hope. Actually, how many people are generally familiar with these kinds of figures? Yeah. So it's really, you're lucky. So it's really sort of inundated in this environment. And Dave would just sort of stand, just sort of stare blankly into space. And, Sam Harris would be like, it's really, it's like Nazi Germany because blah, blah, blah. And he's just like, wow, it's like Nazi Germany, okay. And then people would come with you and they go, these ideas are so important. And what's interesting is in the process of writing this book, because you have to make it bigger than these people. Like this particular scene and act of self-branding is already almost over, and I didn't write the book in time for it to be in the zeitgeist that way. But the arguments that they're using, this is what you're gonna see from every single right-wing movement in the future or center-right movement in the future that does not explicitly identify as nationalist or alt-right. The arguments that they're making about why capitalism just is, that's science, why we're not promoting racism or sexism, but we are very interested in some extremely antiquated ideas about scientific differences, quote unquote, right? So what you're seeing in these arguments, and I'm just gonna bring in 2 other things because there's a lot to cover here and I can kind of get lost in the weeds. A basic difference I would say between left and right is the difference between historicizing and naturalizing. If you're on the left, broadly speaking, you look at things and you say, what are the historical, material reasons why that is happening? If you're on the right, you say that is what it is. Now, paradoxically, this is actually a reason why right now there's a lot of conflict between people who are more socialistic and people who are more like woke, quote unquote. Because their moral dimension is better. Look, America is a racist society is correct. Acknowledging that truth versus denying that truth is a major difference, no question. However, if you read Adolph Reed, who's one of my intellectual heroes, I really hope everybody is reading him, he will tell you why racism and white supremacy is a multi-generational project in America that depends on economic conditions, that manifests in different geographies, that is inseparable for how we produce and do capitalism. And actually, it might become separable, right? Whereas some people who have a woke discourse, it just is. It's the religious foundation of America. There's no difference between any different historical periods. It's just this moral block statement. Does that make sense? So some of these critiques can get really subtle, and that's actually what started to occur to me with the IDW and dealing with the right, because these guys were exploiting a lot of weaknesses. They were coming in and they were seeing people, look, if your pop culture diet, and let's say you're an alienated young man, which is the primary audience for these guys. That's just market demographics. That's not a moral statement. I did some brand work. This is just like you're looking at your demos. You're alienated. You don't feel powerful. You probably have a lot of actually very valid complaints in your life. You flip open, say, some mediocre, bougie website that you think is the left, and what do you have? Seinfeld's actually problematic, and you suck, and shut the fuck up, and this is a problem, and that's a problem, and this is this, and that, And then Jordan Peterson comes along and goes, no, actually, you're great, and you should have a government-provided wife to massage you. Now, and you didn't have people coming and saying, why? Why do you feel like you do? Right? So, because even in terms of relative privilege becomes in macro questions, like in your personal behavior, yes, it's relevant. If you're walking around thinking you're the most victimized person in the world and you're not, it's obnoxious and it's problematic, sure. But in the big picture, nobody outside of an incredible, minute fraction of the population is doing better right now. Yes, you can talk about aggregate numbers and people have more washing machines and cell phones and blah, blah, blah. I know all of that. So please do save those questions and comments. Let's go more interesting. But inequality is rising. Alienation from the work you do is rising. Your ability to govern your own life is decreasing radically. And so you had people who were giving reactionary but constructive, proactive answers, and also empowering people's individual agency, which is funny as a socialist, I think is super important. We need a socialism that also has room for people's personal aspirations and ambitions and sense of making room for themselves in the world. We cannot make that wrong. And in fact, the only people that I really see making that wrong are usually very upper middle class bougie people. And I don't make that as like a moral comment. I'm talking like literally that's their position. They don't have to do that. I could tell you as someone, and I don't want to melodrama my own experience, but it's like, I know what it's like to be pretty broke at times and have like the heat turned off or whatever. So you understand why you might want to read some type of Horatio Alger narrative, right? So the IDW had answers, and the right had answers, and the left had a lot of, the quote-unquote left, had a lot of moralism and condemnation, and not even that much nutrition. I think that is why, among many other things, including the really powerful social movements we have in the world today, and the very important ones on race and economic equity and so on, this is actually also why Bernie Sanders matters. Bernie Sanders is running a campaign that should be really basic and really obvious, but it's not, because we're not in basic and obvious. We are at a level of extreme, radical and systemic inequality. And that's also where we are in terms of our phase of capitalism. Like, yeah, with a more liberal approach, you could juice it a little bit. In fact, you could do a lot of what he's talking about. You can decommodify healthcare, you can make it a public good, you can say that the concentration of wealth cannot be this exactly extreme and ludicrous. But in the big picture, the room for new markets is shrinking. I mean, take away the morals of it. When we were going through the Industrial Revolution or the Consumer Goods Revolution, someone came along and said, hey, can you give me an investment because I want all of a sudden America's going to have a middle class, which was absolutely generated by government spending, let's be real, in the post-World War II. And I want, but I want to sell people dishwashers. Can I have some capital for it? Okay. And then millions of people will buy dishwashers. What phase of capitalism are we in? WeWork was market value. SoftBank put billions of dollars into it's like a place where you commune, man. And that's partially because really there is a shrinking amount of untapped, primitive accumulation, right? So what you have in Bernie Sanders is someone who has an inkling of a recognition of that. And he, by going out and talking about your student loans and how you're objectively materially fucked, is doing more to de-radicalize people in that discourse about online than almost anybody else in the modern scene. I also think foreign policy is really important. And in him, I see the only candidate who's willing to speak somewhat clearly about the Middle East, somewhat clearly about India. He called for freeing President Lula, who people should really look up. He was an extraordinary president who led Brazil, who lifted 40 million people out of poverty. And he almost certainly would have been reelected president in 2018 if there was not an illegitimate process that put him in jail. He was recently freed because the prosecutorial team was humiliated. And I'm always happy to talk about that. So, and I had the honor of interviewing him recently in Sao Paulo. So, that's it, guys. I'm ready to talk. I just wanted to give you a little bit of sense of where I was coming from. Yeah. And thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.
Where do you feel you'd end up if you had been dropped into your situation, say today? Because I think, a lot of people, particularly these alienated young men, YouTube is kind of your university. It's kind of where you find your way, so.
I would still be cool.
Yeah.
No, just kidding. No, that's a really good question. And I think there's a huge amount of value. We need to compete in that terrain, and so I do. Shows like mine are actually important in that. And your professor will like that I say this, and I don't know, whatever, we'll see. But I'm really glad that I spent hours reading books instead of watching YouTube commentary. And that's not because that's just because that was what the environment was, right? So that's better. I think it's fading for a variety of reasons. One, it's being answered. It's also super repetitious. These guys have this same, but all of them, right? It's funny because the guy who's most associated with them, who's got serious popularity, is Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan does a lot of different things on his show. The branded products inside that space, it's okay, because we can't say anything anymore, and that's the thing, and then this is bad because we can't say anything, and the left won't let you say anything, and isn't this amazing that we're saying things to each other? It's pretty dead, it's flat. I think the weaknesses they exploited in the left are still there, which is part of what I'm concerned about answering, because I think these things will morph and get rebranded in more interesting ways.
So I was curious, I was just watching an episode of yours earlier today, and something that kind of came up for me was
Good man, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
And something that came up for me was big tech in particular, especially with this election cycle and how social media plays such an integral role to information being spread during elections. And you had raised issue with Elizabeth Warren's plan to try to regulate social media, where you said that if she's trying to prosecute those that are believed to be spreading misinformation, that it could open the sort of Pandora's box for regulating this type of material. And so I was wondering what you think the role of the federal government should be in trying to regulate this misinformation. And I guess just as an example, as well, if you think that companies should follow the example of, for instance, Twitter, which decided to simply just do a blanket ban of all political advertisements.
Okay, I'll work. I'll go in the flow you asked. That's a really good question. So And this isn't a direct answer, but this is, I feel like, my work. So what I was trying to do in that segment too is to, again, historicize this. I see people on social media and on television. Let me make it really specific. Have you guys ever heard of, and I doubt you have you ever heard of a guy named Joe Lockhart? Okay, he's a CNN pundit. He was Bill Clinton's press secretary. He co-founded a firm called Glover Park Group. Now, Glover Park Group is a major political consulting firm. They've done work for Verizon, for the Saudi royal family, for films that you've seen, for AstroTurf campaigns to try to convince people to cut Medicare and Social Security. There's a lot of firms like this. Dewey Square Group is a firm like this. And so you have people, and I'm not even talking morally, although you could make a moral objection, but they have set the whole stage for what we call fake news. They have set the whole stage for why people don't believe information. They have manipulated science. They have generated campaigns like Dewey Square Group, it was reported, was a masters of, and this is like, they were very big in the 90s, so this is even harder to track without the internet. They were supposedly masters of hiring people who had community, and this is very Mike Bloomberg territory. I think that your professor is, I'm in a school board, and I think that he's a community activist who's concerned about kids in the community and improving their outcomes because I know of his work. I've decided we as a district, or a state more likely, should ban soft drinks in the schools because they're terrible for kids' health. And all of a sudden he comes in and is like, no, it's actually a really bad idea and it affects these different student outcomes. And I'm like, well, that sounds bizarre, but I think this person's credible. He's working for Dewey Square Group, right? That's the type of thing that they did, okay? So in the last couple of years, you have people who have wanted to reduce the result of the 2016 election to fake news or memes or whatever. Nonsense. There's major historical and macroeconomic trends behind that. And if you want to have a conversation about fake news and propaganda and misinformation, this is not a plot in Russia that was hatched. The modern PR industry goes back to, I guess, the 30s or the 20s with Edward Bernays, and is a global product that has affected how we campaign, how kids get exposed to different foods, and so on. So I have a problem philosophically out of the gate with this kind of liberal control freakery, like, well, there are things that are wrong and we're going to tell them that they're right, and partially because I disagree with it and also because it's a fucking loser. You know, like, great, yeah, go up against Donald Trump and tell him that his facts are wrong. Good luck. You know, I mean, so when I see a kind of like, when I see that approach to a problem, I have a huge allergy to it. Now, specifically, one of the things that I saw that she said was that she would make it illegal, as an example, to post fake voting information. Now, I in that totally specific instance, I agree. I don't think that that has been happening for decades. People have put flyers on the billboard, right? Don't forget to vote on Saturday. Like, that should be part of a proposal on voting rights and protecting the ballot in an era of massive voter suppression. Now, to me, I think things like Google and Twitter and so on need to become publicly absorbed utilities. And that will mean that the First Amendment will protect them. And you're gonna have to deal with it. But I'm also confident that if we actually deal with material concentrations of wealth behind propaganda efforts, and we have a bit more of an equitable playing field, that I actually trust people's intelligence and capacity to figure things out. So I hope that answers something. Yeah, of course, yeah.
You talk about socialism, and without getting into the merits of anything here, you're really excited about Bernie Sanders. A lot of people on this side of the political spectrum are, because he's breaking barriers, right? He's introducing an ideology that was sort of banished from American politics. But in polls, most Americans say they won't vote for a socialist. The vast majority of Americans.
Okay, so
yes.
Are we doing polls or not doing polls?
I think we're doing polls that are so
We're
overwhelmingly
doing polls that help
clear.
you.
I think we're doing polls that have such overwhelming
I'm not
margins,
doing it.
they're not going to change.
I'm not doing it. Again, it's no.
You want, all right, you want to throw
If
it
we're
all
going to do
yes.
polls,
Yeah.
Bernie winning head-to-heads. So that's it. And also
Yeah.
socialism is changing radically in polls, and certainly not even just under 35, even in the 40s, it's changing significantly. And if you look at just even today, Congresswoman Dingell from Michigan, she came out, she's like, people need to calm down. This is what my grandfather was trying to do, I believe, when he was in Congress. This is obvious, this is gonna do well in Michigan. So I think what you're finding is that, yes, for some people it'll be a triggering word, but frankly, for a lot of people, Democrat is a triggering word. But you're just watching, like, I would implore you to not just sit with steady cliches, because it's a fluid and dynamic situation. If we want to use numbers, they're on the Bernie side. If you want to look at it in terms of the historical barrier there is to overcome, it's a historical barrier that's worth overcoming, and it's a better bet than fatally flawed candidates who we know will lose and depressed turnout. So that's all I got.
All right. Well, one last thing I'd like to say. The second half of the socialism question is, and I think this is changing because people might have noticed the global economy is teetering, people are getting sick all over the world, but I think my argument isn't really that Bernie's unelectable, it's that he's the candidate who's most dependent on some sort of economic disaster happening, because a big part of his argument is that you talk about these like economically populist, slightly socially conservative voters, and
those are most voters.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. And
like absolutely.
You think he's going to bring them home, right? Bring them back to the Democratic Party.
He needs to bring about 80,000. I just want to be really specific. I'm not trying. People get mad at me, but I got to be really specific.
Yeah.
80,000 votes distributed across Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin wins the election.
A lot of them right here. But,
right.
But I mean, that assumes also he doesn't lose any other voters. Like all the
no,
voters
he will
in the
lose
suburbs.
Westchester, but we'll make up
the
for
suburbs
it by the rest
of these
of
cities.
New York.
Okay. But so I agree with you. Potentially the economy is going to collapse, and I think Bernie might be the best candidate then. But people, despite all the horrible things that are happening, there are too many people in poverty, there are too many people who don't have access to health care, the inequality is disgraceful. But in polls, and again, there's a difference between a poll that shows Bernie winning by 2 more points than someone else and a poll that says the overwhelming majority of Americans, at least as of last week, are
Wait, make the rest of your point, but are we or are we not doing polls?
We're doing polls that are so far outside a changeable margin that they are beyond dispute. There's a real difference between Bernie winning by a 3-point margin.
Okay, then he's the one with the by far most popular personal approval rating of anyone.
But that's simply not true. It's a 3-point difference.
No, that's actually, I'm talking on personal approval rating.
In personal approval rating.
No, that's
not
true.
as a senator in his home state, as a national political figure, his approval rating is 2 to 3 points different.
Let's not get into the minutia. Okay. But what's your point? So he needs an economic collapse because you think most people actually feel okay about the economy.
I think the state of the economy is disgraceful.
So
the question is, can you convince the American people of that?
Here's what I'd say.
Yeah.
It's 2 parts. I would say that we know, and Trump in fact sadly showed us, that a good half of the population, probably more, they don't care what the numbers are. They really are in disgraceful situations. And that is really true. And honestly, like that should not be like a point in our little debate. Like that's the truth. And it's really bad and it's structurally bad, because unless there's serious structural interventions in the economy, people will be driving Ubers and not having pensions. And I mean, life expectancy is decreasing in the United States. The Europeans are like, it's very bad, and people live that and experience that. So I do think speaking clearly to those conditions is not only the right thing, I think it's profoundly helpful. And I think that, again, Hillary Clinton, it's already great. Disaster, right? Now, on the other hand, I think to the extent, again, and I'm not, trying to do like, have my cake and eat it too here, but it's like, yeah, he's an incumbent president with good economic numbers, right? But you cannot convince me. In fact, I would argue that's another argument for Bernie, because if we're just doing a conventional race, then great, there's an incumbent president with good economic numbers. Because what you also have to recognize, and I wish this wasn't true, a lot of Americans don't have the same type of melodramatic response to Trump that we do. Partially because I think the media has done a disgraceful job of not highlighting things like the concentration camps at the border enough, which really are absolute in obscenity and reflect a broader threat to all of us. But in most other things, people don't care. You know what? They're like me. I think this Twitter's awesome. I think it's hilarious. I don't care that he doesn't do this and that. I don't care. There's no normal American who's just like, can you believe that he said that at the NATO meeting? They don't care. And in fact, at this point, what's very disturbing to me is that after all these years of hyperventilating and melodrama and freak out and no strategic hits on him and Russia and yada, 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 he's at a 49% approval rating with a high economic numbers. So once again, pick somebody who can actually fight on different terrain. By the way, terrain he knows how to talk about. None of these other candidates have demonstrated an ability to do that, like at all. To the point where I'm scared. I wish, to be really blunt, I wish there was a backup. This is another trash centrist, but maybe they can win option. I don't want everything to be riding on me and my candidate, but it is, sadly. But also potentially optimistically. We can definitely win this. As far as getting anything done, none of them are going to be able to get anything done. This is another area where, to me, it always has struck me like Bernie is doing like this moonshot strategy. Like, I'm going to become president and I'm going to mobilize popular will. I think Bernie should actually, if the coronavirus becomes a thing, I think he should declare martial law for single payer and then pull it back and then in 5 months be like, okay, it's lifted. Do you really want to take away everybody's health care? And there would be riots if they tried to. I'm only half joking. I think we need a more Republican mindset, though. They understand power. But on a legislative level, you sit there and you say, oh, this is ridiculous. Like, you're going to fly around the country and mobilize people? What? Like, okay, whatever. Okay, sure. Okay, whatever. And what are the alternatives to that? Somebody like, if Biden or Bloomberg are president, they'll go, we're bringing the country together. Mitch McConnell said it was wrong to call children retarded, and we all can agree to not be mean like Mr. Trump, and we're coming together, and he's not gonna say these horrible things on social media, and we have a new blue ribbon commission to cut Social Security, and that's gonna be our big bipartisan push. Biden and Bloomberg are both consistently on public record to want to cut these things. Then you have, and Klobuchar is in that same, and Buttigieg, like nothing will happen. You just won't have Trump be president. And there will be occasional horrible bipartisan deals. And even their healthcare plans, you have to realize that they're not single payer, but an actual public option. By the way, Pete's public option actually increases the individual mandate. So that's not going to be popular when that's road tested. But any of those scenarios, a public option is still objected to by the health insurance industry and it will not pass Congress. So, and then Warren is the worst of both worlds because Warren on her policy level actually pushes some things further but has no strategy for actually getting them done because Congress has not regulated Wall Street or Amazon because there hasn't been smart blog posts written about them, right? It's not regulated because they control the legislative process. So what Bernie's saying might absolutely not work, but it's actually like the only thing at public disposal if you want anything like this to happen. Nothing is gonna happen because somebody woke up and was like, you know what? I've been in Congress for a couple years, all my donors are from certain industries, but I don't think that that's really right. I read a New York Times column, let's pass something. This isn't the West Wing, it's not how the world works. So, you know, and then the last thing really quick, look, I'm into primarying people. And ultimately, if we could reconfigure the Democratic Party, I would be very comfortable with, as an example, not on substantive issues. Substantive issues of people's substantive rights are never compromisable. But if there was a candidate, just as Chuck Schumer was like every working class person, we pick up somebody in the suburbs, every Goldman Sachs senator that puts out a woke tweet on Pride Day, I will trade for a pro-civil rights, anti-Wall Street senator who's like, I own a gun. I'll trade it, happily. So this is also a bigger contest about the nature of the party. And I don't want, ultimately, the Democratic Party, I don't think it will become a socialist one, but I think it can become a serious labor populist one. I don't want a party built and configured around upper middle class attitude and social belief voting. It's not a majority, it's not durable, and it's not producing outcomes for working people. Bernie Sanders becoming president is absolutely more important than a couple of, former CIA agents representing the Democrats in the House and handing the gavel to Nancy Pelosi. Yes, absolutely.
You're talking about keeping Mitch McConnell in power. You're talking about making Kevin McCarthy the Speaker of the House.
Yes.
This isn't.
Look, again, okay, this is where these things get frustrating. That's not what I'm talking about. I've actually explained a lot, but look, if you're gonna, let's do more of what I'm actually saying, which is that if you want to force, I could just be like, I'm not gonna answer that question because I think Bernie will make everybody win. If you're forcing me into a binary of, do I think it's more important that an actual progressive force for all of global politics occupy the most powerful position on earth versus a couple point margin in a lower house of government that he will definitionally override? Yes, I think that's more important. Yes.
So Marco, you take the position that if Sanders is president, he actually won't advance the progressive agenda to the same degree that other more moderate Democratic candidates were. I think that's your position.
Yes. Hello, good evening.
Hi.
To elaborate on Professor's point here, that not that I doubt Sanders' zeal for progressive causes, simply that I doubt that he has the ideological flexibility to compromise to advance legislation where it'd be possible, even if the Democrats can retake the Senate or retake the House. I doubt that it would be by a sufficient margin that the Democrats could pass whatever they want. And so to advance meaningful legislation, we're going to have to compromise with the Republicans in one manner or another.
What are you thinking of as meaningful legislation, and what do you actually think? Let's just take healthcare, because now you're talking about Republicans. I totally agree with you that he's going to deal with Democrats and whatever. Look, if you look at his actual career, one of his major legislative accomplishments is a veterans' right bill that he wrote with John McCain. So, sometimes with people who are like really hyped about him on my side, you kind of actually are quietly like, that Bernie Sanders is not really like a Sandinista, right? Like he's a very effective legislator and mayor. So, and read Matthew Iglesias' piece in Vox, which is not exactly my ideological home, and it's called like Bernie Sanders is actually a very conventional politician, and he talks about his deal making and so on. But if I was going to take from you some type of commitment to a real progressive issue, like giving everybody health care, I just return you again to, first of all, I think we all know the very basic idea that you get to the best place you want. If you ask him for an extension, do you ask him for 1 day or a week? Hopefully you meet in the middle. If you go in and say, you can have a day, even if he says yes, you're not going to be where you want. So I would just say that with regards to something like that, we got to get back to the two things I outlined before, which is that one, you always start from an aggressive, strong, clear position and you mobilize people. That's just power. That's how politics works. And Republicans understand that better. And then the second thing, if you are actually talking about advancing legislation that implicates corporate America, it doesn't matter whether it's a small, soft reform. It will be fun. Obamacare specifically brought pharma and healthcare in as stakeholders. It does nothing but good for them. It forces millions of people into a marketplace, and government subsidizes people buying that product. That still was almost killed. There's ideological and political reasons behind it. So if you come in and you say like, hey, you know what, I'm not Bernie, I'm going to be reasonable, and here's my Joe Biden public option plan. Well, we're just back to 2008. It'll get killed, and it'll be even worse because people won't mobilize and do anything for it. So we will have dead legislation, except for teaming up to do things like cut Medicare and Social Security.
I'm just as jaded as you about the likelihood of any legislation being passed from the Democratic side from any of the candidates. However, I think that Bernie has made his career off of ideological purity.
No,
no,
that's wrong. Read the Matthew Iglesias piece.
I see. In any case, that a candidate who would be more willing, not just on healthcare, not just on pharmaceuticals, but in any sort of legislation to come to the middle to compromise if need be to advance legislation.
I don't buy the premise of the question. So, you know, and I tried, and also I would say the other thing too is that he can do a huge amount, which I think is a broader structural problem, but a lot he can do on an executive branch level. But the idea that Bernie's going to sit there, I mean, you got to read about the guy's career. Like, there is a reason that a 79-year-old Jewish man who's a socialist is a main presidential contender. That's not because he sat in a co-op in Vermont. It's just like, no. Come on, like, let's be real. You got to read up on him.
But I think it's
I mean, do you have anything else you want to ask though? Because that one's just, you know, we're at loggerheads.
Yes, I disagree with that as
Okay,
well.
cool.
Yes.
But read the Iglesias piece.
Right,
Read
and
up
so
on
lastly, that's we look at 2018 when the Democrats won the House of Representatives on a decisive margin. I think there's a broad agreement among analysts that was based on defending the Affordable Care Act, which enjoys great support among Americans.
It was based, I'm sorry, is that?
Healthcare is such an essential winning issue for the Democrats that by moving to a far more divisive, not as popular bipartisan plan as Medicare for All compared to simply defending the Affordable Care Act would be too risky.
All right.
Yes.
This is hard because I feel like a broken record. But again, there is no bipartisan healthcare plan. Obamacare was passed with the votes of 3 Republicans, one of whom became a Democrat, one of whom is retired, one of whom is Susan Collins. It's not, that's false. That in the Senate, that's the vote totals. That's why it was passed through reconciliation. So there isn't a bipartisan healthcare bill, and the ACA was in fact for years extremely unpopular. It became popular when, and this is a very easy issue, and it's not a presidential campaign issue. It's very much a midterm thing because you're not running on an affirmative agenda. Bernie Sanders was one of the main people in 2017 who defended Obamacare because the argument wasn't about the whole structure of the bill. The argument was, ironically, you're going to, well, partially the patient protections, which are really important, but also you're going to get rid of the Medicaid expansion, which is what? Kind of government health care, right? You're going to kick tens of millions of people out of your health care. So, yeah, that's super easy. That's a very effective midterm win, and no one made the case more across the country than Bernie Sanders. In a presidential election, it's still more, it's much more effective and much more strategic to actually have a position yourself. I think standing up there on stage and saying, I'm going to defend Obamacare, it's so great, and then, Trump, it doesn't matter. Everybody seems to think that Trump's like, I agree with you, he isn't that popular, but there's enough people, people still think that we got him. It doesn't matter. Yeah, Donald Trump spent 2 years trying to get rid of people's health care. You know what he'll say on stage with Joe Biden? It's a disgrace, and people have to pay for it, and it's not working. You know what we're going to do? We're going to get everybody fantastic health care. And Joe Biden's going to go, I was the guy who, what? Bernie Sanders is going to say, no, how about no bullshit? How about everybody has health care? And yes, look, we're going back into poll territory. I read the polls the way I want to read them. It's a 70% poll. You put in other questions, it comes closer to 50%. But again, no, that's 30% on Medicare for All. Where are you seeing that? No, where? No. Well, okay, yes, okay. If you ask the most, okay, all right, dude, come on. If you ask a pure Republican talking point, yes.
No, I'm not trying to antagonize. I am just saying that I think that there's this idea that Medicare for All is very popular among Americans.
No, if you frame it correctly, it's very popular. Mm-hmm. If you ask a Republican talking point that terrifies people and causes anxiety and is completely dishonest, it's unpopular. I've never seen the 30% one. That still seems really, I would have to assume that that's literally a Republican push poll just saying Bernie Sanders doesn't want anybody to ever see a doctor, right? But if you get into the polls that are real, right, where you say it does this, but it does that, it might do this, it might do that, we're still in the 50s if we're talking about real polls. So I'm comfortable making that fight. And again, what I want to keep stressing, I looked at Pete Buttigieg's plan. The most unpopular part of Obama's plan was that you get a tax penalty if you do not buy private health insurance. That number gets jacked up under Buttigieg's plan. Donald Trump, I can't even not describe to you how much fun he'd have running on that. Like, this guy, he looks like the Mad Magazine. He wants to raise your taxes. And that is, by the way, another advantage that Bernie has that I think does not get put across enough in collegiate and other kind of intellectual environments. A lot of stuff is just style and presentation. He doesn't care. And Chris Christie actually said this on TV the other day. He's totally right. He's like, yeah, Bernie is effective in these debates because he doesn't care. Okay, blah, 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 Castro, I heard you. Anyways, back to my plans. And we all know from polls that if you talk to most people, and maybe this is unfortunate, they really are mostly voting on personal qualities.
Right.
They really are, and that's another advantage that he has mostly overall. And to the extent he has disadvantages, again, unfortunately the other candidates exceed them in terms of communicative ability and likability and stuff like that. If Barack Obama was running, you guys would have a case, and I would just be like, come on, let's give Bernie a chance. We got to do this.
When it comes to personal qualities as well, though, something many Americans are afraid of is the age of these candidates. Bernie Sanders is 78 years old. Like most Americans are.
Donald Trump's in his 70s.
No, yeah, and Joe Biden is 77, and Elizabeth Warren is 70.
70, virgin.
No, Joe Biden's an old 77. Like I understand. Like I get it.
All right,
I get it.
So let's pare this down. Do you want us to nominate Pete Buttigieg, a 37-year-old mayor with horribly unpopular policies who will really mobilize?
I'm not trying to advocate for anybody.
But that's the only way this conversation can be productive, is because, again, if we want to just sit, look, here, you know what, man? Bernie's 78. He says he's a socialist. He yells sometimes. Yeah, that could be tough. Okay. Compared to what? What are the other options? You know, Bernie will always come up short to the imaginary fantasy candidate we have in our heads.
I don't think it's unreasonable to want somebody who doesn't call himself a socialist, who's not geriatric. Like I think that it's like, cool. I don't think we're shooting for the moon there. You know.
Well, in this primary, you are.
There are 4 candidates who don't fit those positions.
So cool. Who do you think? I mean, if you think, I don't want to argue the relative electoral merits of any of them, but there's no one that jumps out as in any way being stronger.
Well, I
don't want a charisma-free, unpopular centrist. Is that too much to ask? Is it too much to ask to not have a 37-year-old mayor who does a terrifying Obama impression that nobody likes outside of a white college campus, right? Like, is it too much to ask to not have like a senile 77-year-old with like endless amounts of like serious questions about his campaign contributions and record? Is it too much to ask to not have like an oligarch who instituted an apartheid system of racial terrorism in New York? I would hope to see that none of these things are too much to ask, but it looks like they are, because that's where we're at. But obviously no one's, don't vote for Bernie. I mean, sure, but there isn't what you guys want. That's what I would leave the argument with. Not like vote whoever you want, and I'm not discounting the legitimate concerns, but what you want in contrast to him does not exist in this field or in the modern Democratic Party. And to the extent people thought they existed, how did those people do? The biggest call I was wrong in this election, I thought Kamala Harris was going to be super formidable. Not popular.
Hi.
Hi.
So my first question, it says on your Twitter that you're Jewish. Am I getting this right?
No.
Is it the right Twitter?
On my Twitter bio, it says I'm Jewish?
No, but like in your tweets. I don't want to.
I have Jewish background.
Okay. So as someone with a Jewish background,
Yes.
how do you feel about Bernie's plan for Israel, especially as someone concerned with foreign policy?
I love it. It's absolutely necessary. My Jewish values teach me to oppose apartheid.
Okay. Could you elaborate, please?
I mean, there really isn't that much to elaborate on. I mean, has anybody ever been not only to Israel but also to the? Have you been to the West Bank? Have you been to Gaza? You went to Gaza. Oh, okay, but not to Gaza. Well, I know people who've gone to Gaza. You could definitely go to Gaza. So for me, my politics are built on a base of, economic justice and actually really like anti-racism, in some ways as distinct from some of this sort of woke stuff in a way. But when I was already, I grew up, I was pretty connected to left politics, so I always knew growing up about the travesty that was the human rights situation. And I knew that people I admired, like Nelson Mandela, said, South Africa is going to not be properly free until the Palestinians are free. In 2006, I believe, I read a piece by a guy named Tony Judt in the New York Review of Books, who was a really important Jewish scholar. And he just said, the argument was that, literally this is childish. The idea that you have an ethno-state or a religious state, if you're committed to any type of broad-based social, economic equity and civil society, it doesn't work. No matter how justified, right? Of course there's justification because of Jewish history for Israel. There's justification for Kurdistan because of Kurdish reality. There's justification for Pakistan. It's notable that Israel and Pakistan are both disasters. Israel not in the sense of, look, if you're a European Jewish background, you have a nice life there. If you're not, you are, even inside 67 borders, not a fully equal citizen. And the situation in the West Bank it is literally Jim Crow-like, and Gaza is, it's just an atrocity. So that's not something that anybody could reasonably ask me to support. And I understand, there's some actions from some Palestinian groups that, we can condemn. In fact, those have not even really been in any way seriously in play since 2003. And when we talk about, look, and the apartheid word specifically is both used by people who were crucial in ending apartheid in South Africa, like Desmond Tutu or Ronnie Kasrils, who served as intelligence minister under Mbeki, who I've interviewed. And the other main people who use the apartheid word are Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak. So it is what it is. And I don't support second-class citizenship and occupation and sieges for anybody, no matter who they are.
Are you not concerned about the binary between either condemning Israel entirely, being also a stance that a lot of very strong and notorious anti-Semitic people agree with, versus seeing this as more of a complex issue where it is wrong what's going on, and that there's also a way to do this, that Israel still exists and is supported?
So it's not a complex issue. That's the big thing. It's super simple. There's one group that has enormous power. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States. It acts on another population of people with total impunity and is never held accountable for anything. So there's no symmetry in the relationship, period. And just as a thought experiment, IDW people, if we know that if somehow a population of Jewish refugees ended up in West Bank and Gaza, and an Arabic government in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv had an open-air prison in Jewish Gaza, which they bombed with white phosphorus, they killed civilians indiscriminately, and they had no provisions for medicine. They had an embargo that blocked food, that the electricity wasn't running, that there was an over 48% unemployment rate, life expectancy and malnutrition statistics were horrifying. One of the major policymakers in this hypothetical Arabic Palestinian state said, we need to put those Jews on a diet. In the West Bank, there was another Jewish area where there was a little bit more autonomy, but there was regular Arabic settlements where they pulled up the Jewish farmers' foods, they terrorized them with rocks, the security forces broke children's bones, and they couldn't drive their own roads. We'd all have no problem understanding what that was. So there's nothing complex about it. The second part of your question, it's a pure asymmetry relationship. And the question is rights or not. So that's it, it's not complicated. The second part of your question, at this point, there's always going to be crackpots who are anti-Semitic who condemn Israel. That's not what drives the movement. particularly in the United States. If you work around most people who are concerned with this issue, it's actually populated with a lot of Jewish people. The real question we have to ask is, why is it that AIPAC is hosting an information minister for Slobodan Milosevic? Why is it that there's relationships between the Israeli government and far-right parties in Europe? Why is it that Benjamin Netanyahu's son is posting borderline alt-right memes? Why is it that Israel is an alt-right state, even though it is from the descendants of the victims of one of the greatest crimes in history? That's a serious question, and that's inseparable from the racism of the project, which goes back to the first part that we have to solve. But thank you, shalom. And I am serious about it coming from Jewish values. Like Tony Judd, my reading, to the extent I do, which I actually do have some connection to that in a religious sense, it's unacceptable for me. But yeah, no, I know. But it's not complicated.
You said something about people kind of coming to the right because they have these certain material problems and they look for it in the media, but because there's no like major like leftist media outlet, they don't really like get those answers, and so they kind of like am I not characterizing this correctly?
There's some truth to that. I also think a lot of what they like encounter in like liberal whatever is going to be very alienating to them.
Yeah.
So that's part of it.
Yeah. I guess my concern is like if the Red Scare never happened, and if there were like sort of true like a meaningfully socialist party or media outlets or whatever, I think there's kind of this fundamental problem of like most people in any kind of political position are not going to be experts at convincing people. Like if you if you look at like
we have too much of a Democratic Party in this country. That is a very to have a main center-left party that produces generations of people. It's like, I think political leadership job is convincing people of things. And I'm not attacking you at all. I just think, of course, political leadership is, of course, effective political leadership involves convincing people of things. Of course. Yeah. And to the extent that you think that, I think you're right. I think it's a product of a lot of people doing a terrible job at that. Yeah. But of course it's part of that job. Of course. Why are we doing any of this? I wasn't in any way good enough to like play professional tennis or something, which seems way more fun. We are theoretically, trying to convince people. And if you're running for office, if you're trying to do something, of course. Part of what I point to in my book too is it's not all just a question of political leadership. Mm-hmm. Have you guys ever heard of something called Cooperation Jackson, Mississippi? So it's a very interesting work of people who had a black nationalist project. They ended up, Chokwe Lumumba became the mayor. But it wasn't just a political project, it was actually an effort at a cooperative economy. So there's community-supported agriculture, there's cooperatively owned businesses and things like this. And actually, if you look, that sector of the economy is much larger than people realize. And I check out Professor Richard Wolff, who I have a lot on my show, but I'd really look at his work on this. He's an economics professor at the New School. And so as an example, Madrigal in Spain is a major economic hub, and it's cooperatively owned. And it competes at a regional level very effectively. So part of what I was saying was that I think that these guys are speaking very effectively to people's alienation. There's a lot of sense of sadness, of separation, of lack of meaning, lack of purpose. In a weird way, intellectually, I find Peterson to just, be retrograde and ridiculous. And I know people will be watching this. I can already see the comments. But I actually think the concerns he's talking to are super real, right? Like even just like in pop discourse, okay, is something like incel, right? Is that associated with misogyny? Is that a problem? Absolutely, that's part of it. But also, we all just go like, haha, you fucking loser, versus being like, wow, that actually sounds horrifying and really sad and really isolating and like a big problem. Probably, and I read a fascinating piece once that actually that term was originally coined by a woman to describe her experience. So we're talking about not gender specific. It does affect a lot of young men. And by the way, that's significant. You can't, even if somebody has relative privilege, it's still a problem socially and economically. So to your question on maybe, which I hope I'm interpreting right, on the more day in and day out level, is that I think that, and so what Peterson's saying in response to this whole world that is chaotic and there's diminished life prospects is, clean your room and watch my videos, basically. And I'm saying maybe if people in their own lives had a greater ownership over their work, they would feel better. Maybe if they were in cooperative efforts with people they were around, that might generate a sense of meaning and purpose. And that your seeking of meaning and purpose is awesome. And we should honor that impulse, not how it manifests, but the impulse.
If I'm talking to people like politically, how do I guess I'm just concerned with like actually engaging with people politically in like a way that could be.
Ask people what they care about.
Okay.
And listen to them. I know. I know I'm not good at it.
Yeah.
But you have to work. That's if you talk to anybody. But it's not. We have different roles people play. But I feel like when you're talking about like organizing, if you talk to people who organize, who are in the process, and if you ever do it, if you go door to door for Bernie, or you go door to door for Medicaid expansion, or any candidate, people don't. You have a script, sort of, to keep you in bounds, but no one says like, "Hey, hope you're enjoying dinner. I have a good candidate. Shut up. Let me tell you." Right? What are you concerned about? What are you thinking about? It really is a process of, it's like emotional intelligence, basically.
The socially enlightened left tends to be stereotyped by people who are rich, elite, quote, limp-wristed crybabies who don't want to work, and so people who may not buy into socialist ideas or ultra-left rhetoric, they take that stereotype, they close their ears. I've door knocked for a bunch of candidates in Massachusetts.
Where are you from, Massachusetts?
I'm from Cambridge. So like, we're talking real liberal here, but I've door knocked and people.
There's a lot of working class neighborhoods, and you go to certain places in Cambridge, like, dude, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, no. So
get off of my porch.
So exactly, I've door knocked to people, and I've presented my little spiel, and they've been like, why would I listen to you? Like,
You're a college student.
You're a college kid. You're rich. You don't know anything I'm talking about.
Right.
You don't know how I live. I throw in the little Boston accent. Maybe they give me a little bit, but they don't really want to engage with me.
Yeah.
So what is your counter to that? Because as you sit here, when I listen to you, obviously you present a very good and easily digestible case for socialism. But someone's not going to want to talk to me about that. So how do you engage with the person that maybe is center left or maybe center and just wants to throw your ideas out the window and doesn't want to talk to you anyway?
That's tricky. Okay, so you're not talking. I thought when we were talking about the Cambridge people telling you to get off their porch, maybe that was like a little bit of a different type of voter, different type of thing than center or center left. So let me just make a distinction also between ultra left rhetoric versus actual programs. So one of the things, like, I don't like ultra left rhetoric of any kind.
Well, so I'm saying.
Sorry?
Well, so I'm saying I wasn't contesting ultra left programs. I was just saying the rhetoric turns people off. Listening to the idea.
So that's the part I completely agree with you. I think you're totally right, and I think that there is a lot of. I think that there's a lot of real problems with how people communicate these ideas. I think they're really limiting. I think they, as I said in the beginning, I want to be the pre-mainstream. I don't want to be a subculture. So I see people sometimes, they go, yeah, we're going to go out there and I'm going to terrorize people with Mao quotes. Like, I don't know, like, what are you talking about, right? Like, and I think that part of that honestly does actually, like, that stereotype of, effete liberal or whatever, that has a lot of origins behind it. There's problems with that, obviously. But like, yeah, it's a problem that the left has basically for decades been essentially only on college campuses in a certain way. That's a huge problem. That's a problem. There's a specific type of social training. There's a specific type of rhetorical strategy that doesn't work on most people. That's another thing that why I really would strongly distinguish between social habits and rhetoric versus substantive rights. Like you see this in groups. If somebody came to a group and said, I'll help fight for Medicare for all with you guys, but I don't want gay people here, we would say, no, you can't. No, we don't do that, period. Now, if somebody comes in and they say, hey, I want to work for Medicare for all with everybody in this group, and I thought this Bill Burr podcast was pretty funny, and somebody's like, wait, we need to process that for 15 hours. Disaster. Alienating, embarrassing, weird, not helpful. So I would make a very clear distinction between program and rhetoric. And I think also, by the way, like the socialism word, like back to your guys' concerns about Bernie winning, I'm hoping that Bernie talks a hell of a lot more about FDR than socialism over the next couple of months. I'm hoping that Bernie goes to those older folks and says, you know, look, he can't get away from the word. I'm someone who cares in the long term about that word because that's my political program. But if I was in my imaginary life, I wouldn't have to deal with that word either. However, we will. And so if he says, it's pretty simple. I'm trying to finish the New Deal. FDR talked about the 4 freedoms. That's my package. I've done that anecdotally with older voters. They go, oh, well, FDR is good. So Lula, I'm not saying to talk necessarily about President Lula to average swing voters. That guy, but that being said, no, but honestly, you know what's funny is that I know people through covering him, a former president of Brazil and political prisoner, guys come up to me at live shows who are like, you know, I mean, look, they're into my show, so they're into politics, but they're definitely not part of any type of college, academic, whatever. That guy's cool, I follow him on Instagram, the pictures of him playing soccer are awesome. You read his interview, you watch my interview with him, he's talking about how people buy beer. I had a program so people could get, you know, buy a cup of coffee. When they buy coffee, they, you know, I'm not doing it justice, but he's speaking, and I think that's another thing. You're talking about somebody who rose up from being impoverished, illiterate metal worker who lost a finger, never went to college, and then became the most popular and effective president in Brazil's history, and is a brilliant statesman. He wasn't trained in one of these institutions. Now, it's not black or white. Of course, people come out of these institutions who are great leadership, and we're not trying to demonize college, but no, don't embrace being part of a subculture. And make a distinction between substantive rights and commitments, which are non-negotiable, and cultural practices and preferences, which just reflect your cultural training and class position, have no substance, and are probably mostly in the way.
And then so just as a follow-up question, my personal opinion, I think, you know, Facebook pages like Occupy Democrats, it's great because you watch it, you know, you get the snaps, but you know, it's not focusing necessarily on substantive issues and the solutions. It's buying into that subculture narrative.
Right.
I think that that's harmful to the greater acceptance of these ideals. What do you think?
Well, I can't criticize, honestly, just because I don't read it, so I won't criticize a specific page. But I would just say again, to reflect what I said before, I'll just say it in a different way. Just be very aware of what you're doing. Like, you know, conservatives make all this hay about safe spaces, right? Safe spaces, safe spaces. First of all, they all want safe spaces. So who are we kidding? But you do have to distinguish. Look, everybody should have access to things called safe spaces in a very broad sense, in terms of very basic mutual levels of respect. And then you say, like, we're doing different things. Say, I don't know, you want to do like a social club or a spiritual thing or whatever, or a sports thing that's around a specific interest. Maybe you have it at your apartment instead of a broader, you know, public space. Then yeah, the rules of etiquette for that can be much tighter. You want to build a mass political organization to elect somebody president or push a major piece of legislation? Again, substantive rights, non-negotiable. You cannot control the way people speak about everything. You can't control the culture that they like. You can't control how they express themselves. You can't control how they move. You can't control what they think is funny. You can't control, even within other bounds, different opinions they may or may not have, and nor should you. So I would make really strong distinctions there. And we do not want socialism to be a plaything for the rich. We want it to be a real program that gives healthcare to people and other things that people need, as well as ensuring substantive rights.
So I'm going to come over here in just a second, guys. But since you mentioned Lula, so just so everyone knows, because I know not everyone studies Latin America, like Lula, as Michael said, was the president from 2002 to 2010, Brazil. As you said, widely considered one of the best, if not the best, most effective presidents in Brazil's history. But I was just curious to get your thoughts on the left swept to power in Latin America from the late 1990s through the first decade of the 2000s. And the left took different forms, and some commentators divided it into like the radical leftists, and Chavez sort of represented the radical leftists, and then the moderate leftists, and Lula was really kind of like the equivalent of Chavez on the other side. He was considered a very moderate leftist, and famously, wrote a letter to investors in the lead up to the 2002 election saying, "I'm not going to mess with, our relatively orthodox fiscal and monetary policy."
Right.
And he lifted a lot of people out of poverty, but that was through it wasn't by dismantling capitalist structures as much as it was skimming some wealth off the top and distributing a lot of it to the poorest 20%. So my question to you is what was your position on those debates? Because Lula drew some fire from people on the left in Brazil and international commentators for kind of selling out the PT's socialism of yesteryear, because it used to be a more radical left wing.
Right. So I think that it's a dialectic, because I think on one hand I have very little patience for, it kind of relates back to his question. Like, a lot of the critique that came against Lula was people who were not doing anything, right? Like, there was that element of, 40 million people are getting lifted out of poverty, but I don't like X, Y, and Z. Well, all these incredible accomplishments are happening, but I don't like X, Y, and Z. Now, I think I think he's objectively the best president of the 21st century, and I also think even just in terms of what he did on foreign policy, given Brazil is a mid-ranked country, is extraordinary. I obviously also think Chavez was a great president, absolutely. But I also think that the lesson, particularly of a place like Lula, should be very sobering for people on both sides of that equation. Because, like my friend Bhaskar Sunkara, who founded Jacobin, this dog is amazing. It is, hi!
Just doesn't care.
How you doing? That's why she's so cool. He said, he became a Marxist because of his conservative, he's like, by temperament, I wish that a social democratic model would work. But the way capitalism works, it never seems to be durable. So, yes, you had a presidency that lifted tens of millions out of poverty. The economy did great. Things worked very well. He acquiesced to all sorts of problems. I mean, he's been really upfront. He basically was like, look, by the time I was becoming president, I wanted to get rid of hunger in this country, period. And I was willing to negotiate other things. And he did, he got rid of hunger. So when you look at it and you see the success and you see the model that was created and the fact that there was still this backlash from the US foreign policy because they wouldn't privatize Petrobras, which is their state oil company, and you look at the wealthy in Brazil, who clearly, as Lula said to me in the interview, he said, poor people could fly when I became president. And you would hear people in Rio de Janeiro go, the airports look like bus stations. That level of social entitlement and resentment, as well as the fact that I don't know if that model, as again, the capitalist pie shrinks, is replicatable. Lula himself says, we were talking about Uber, he's like, yeah, it's a different set of challenges. I would be a more radical president today. And not because it's interesting, his instincts are really, he's a labor negotiator. He really believes in legit, you get everybody and you sit down and you figure it out. He said it, he's like, my politics are more like German labor, whatever. But it doesn't work. And then frankly, you look at Venezuela, which is a whole other thing, but I will just say, there's valid criticisms there, but there's also the fact that people repeat a lot of cliches that are not substantiated, and they also, if your prime concern is lifting people out of poverty, which is mine, they lifted millions out of poverty. And if I'm Maduro, and I'm getting sanctimonious lectures about my relationship with the military, I would say, but why is it somehow that I've still survived in power? Even as the US has tried to dislodge me every single day. And people like Lula and even Morales, this whole idea that Morales was some autocrat, ridiculous, knocked out. So Lula, it's a tremendous tragedy, because if there was even just a willingness for, you know, policymakers and capital to say, Brazil can have a new deal, we could have a very nice model, but that apparently is not agreeable to them. So I don't like that the left moralized them and undermined their achievements and demanded, like, well, why isn't Lula doing what, you know, I don't like that. But on the other hand, I think the success and what it resulted in is showing the limits of that model.
So you spoke a little bit in the beginning, like the woke voters and like those who share like woke versus socialist mentality, sort of, which I found interesting and agreed with, and especially with the rise of like the woke culture in younger millennial and Gen Z voters.
Yeah.
One thing that has been spoken about is sort of like diversity on a democratic stage.
Right.
And like while being the most electable candidate, Bernie's still sort of like the elderly straight white man. So do you think him getting the Democratic nomination will sort of cause a further schism between specifically the Democratic Party and voters? Or do you think like once he gets it, the sentiment of anyone beating out Trump for the presidency will sort of unify?
So I have to ask you, I'm trying to learn from your professor. I think there's truth to what you said. There was multiple candidates of color who performed abysmally. Why do you think that is?
I don't know, I sort of feel like, I don't know, after the 2016 election, the stage obviously changed a little, so I don't really know, but I feel that I feel people sort of lean towards what they expected to, overall in America, beat out President Trump.
I think it's terrible, and I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
And that is
like without a doubt, like the ones they thought would.
I think there's some truth to that. And a critique of wokeness and saying we need to understand these things in material and not moralistic terms is not a denial of those things. So let's be really clear about that, right? These things are very real. I also would point you to, a great anecdote, I believe was in the New York Times. This gentleman, African-American voter, I think in South Carolina, said, hey, it would be great to vote for Kamala or Booker, but they're not talking like Bernie and I need health care. You have to look, and this is actually another problem that I have with wokeness as it is expressed, because it turns, like, there is no single African-American vote. There is absolutely, like, of course, my friend Phil, who worked at Goldman Sachs, whose family's from Barbados, yes, he gets racially profiled by police, just as my friend who, didn't go to Duke and works in a different field, right? And they have huge disparities between them, but there is an overlap in experience of race in policing, for sure. By the way, big overlap with class in policing that is transracial, no doubt. At the same time, even just in New York City alone, what the black vote in Brooklyn is versus Harlem is radically different. Brooklyn is filled with people from the Caribbean, from Trinidad, from Jamaica, from Barbados. You go to Manhattan, you have people from the Great Migration. You have a political machine that goes back to Adam Clayton Powell through Charlie Rangel, and even in some respects onto today. So, as Adolph Reed Jr. said to me once, I loved, he said, what organization in America, I'm switching to another group of importance in terms of rights. He said, what organization in America represents more transgender people than any other group in the country? Does anybody know? The AFL-CIO. What did you say? Oh, no. Well, okay, no, good, all good. I didn't know it, but it's the AFL-CIO. Who has more concentrations of black woman power and representation than any other groups in the country? Labor unions. If you implemented Bernie Sanders' agenda, which is not, yes, it is a class-oriented material agenda, and good, we need that. That would still represent the greatest racial transfer of wealth in this country since Reconstruction. because we actually all know that these things are manifest, of course, along racial lines. That's another reason that this woke stuff is so disgusting. It teaches Mike Bloomberg to say, I recognize my privilege. Okay, great, awesome. Can I keep my money? It's bullshit. And I think that there are people in the media class who are totally, look, they're wealthy. Great, let's all sit around and check each other's privilege and come up with new discourses and new ways to terrorize people and control people. Let's have pogroms on each other because you said the wrong thing or you did a mistake. You gotta get rid of all of that shit. But if you actually want to solve these problems, of course there's an array of policy issues, and of course some of them are race and gender specific. But it's totally inseparable from economic actual power. And the way those discursive strategies are used is actually to obscure them just because it's a social etiquette. Like, hey, I'm Michael, I have white male privilege. Thank you, Michael. Okay, I'm gonna go. So what, look at everybody on that stage. My friend was joking. He said, look, Bernie it's like Cornel West said. He's like, look, Bernie's older. He doesn't know all the buzzwords, but he does have values. So we were joking, Bernie's the type of person who might just appoint like a cabinet that's 90% women, but forget to brag about it. So let's, I think what you raise is America. It's vitally important, but there's a much bigger, and that's where my critique is coming from. It's not coming from the highlighting of those issues. Anybody that literally critiques the highlighting of those issues is, somebody I have to write a book about or make fun of on my show.
Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Earlier you were speaking on the importance of individual agency, aspiration, and how that fits into socialism, for example.
Right.
But speaking on, for example, Bernie Sanders' policies in particular, how does something like a federal jobs guarantee play into that? Because I feel like it's a step in the wrong direction, because I don't really think it provides for any room.
Well, when I say aspiration, I don't mean the daily Herculean struggle for basic survival.
Right. I understand that.
No.
Yeah.
No. So yeah, and it's a problem because these things get equated. My analogy, I'm a socialist. I still want there to be an NBA team that wins, but I don't want people to struggle how to feed, clothe, and live. So the federal jobs guarantee not only is part of solving that problem, it's also vitally important for giving labor power to get people to lord over business. And that's another thing too. Your aspirations and Lula is a pretty fucking ambitious guy. He came from literal dirt poverty to become president. He did that through labor. You don't think that expresses personal ambition? It has nothing to see. That's the problem. Is that these things get connected in ways that are a problem. We say bureaucracy and we think government. What do you think happens when you're on the phone with your airline or HMO and they're not helping you? What is that? It's called a bureaucracy. But because in America we have so much stupidity and propaganda, we've been trained bureaucracy only happens by government. So, ambition means that everybody starves on the street and then you try to you try to come up with some dumb widget factory or be a lunatic like Elon Musk on Twitter. These qualities are important. They should be recognized. They have nothing to do with people being immiserated and not having power.
Right, but I think when you move past that on a base level, it's more about providing meaning for people. When you have aspirations, finding maybe meaning rather than, just becoming rich or, living this crazy life or having this daily struggle like you talked about.
So I would say that if we provide, if every single human being had food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, material security, then they would move from horrific, meaningless, preventable suffering to productive and interesting suffering. And then let's see what happens.
Sure.
Yeah. That's it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
From what I can tell, liberals are more scared of Bernie Sanders' brand of socialism than they are of Donald Trump's continuance of the status quo. And so, I guess my question to you is, what should I do as a person who sees more moral clarity on my Twitter than in the Washington Post and the New York Times? How do I, what is this future of media, leftist media going to look like? Yeah.
I'm a patron of my show. No, actually, honestly, independently of that, it actually disturbs me how important I think our independent media discourse is, because it's a disaster on television, ideologically and in terms of what they cover. If you're watching it all day, you're an idiot. You don't know anything. you know, and you have a magical view of the world. Like everything is, you know, he clapped back and Russia did that, and it's embarrassing. But I would want to make a really big distinction, as tough as I am on like a certain type of liberal, because, you know, they are what they are. Make a big, but make a really big distinction between, you know, like someone of good faith who genuinely is appalled by Donald Trump, and they will end up voting for Bernie Sanders. They actually care about this stuff. They're just not where you or I are. You really have to make that distinction. And that's what I would say is like, all this Bernie bro bullshit is just classist, racist nonsense. But be kind to your peers and be totally, you know, ruthless with institutions, right? So I think that, you know, as best you can, we all make mistakes and we all struggle and we all, like, it's another reason I don't like this puritanical culture. We all need to, like, we all make mistakes. We all have character defects, right? We all need to know that and act with a little bit of humility. Or try to, when we fail and fail. So, that being said, I think that clearly there is a segment of the Democratic establishment, if you want to call it that, yeah, I think they would basically probably prefer Trump to Bernie. They have 4 years, they can fundraise off of it. They don't have any actual skin in the game. They're, you know, let's be real here. They are in heavily policed, you know, metro areas that, you know, that cater to them as upper middle class, predominantly white people. They certainly don't have relatives in cages. They certainly are not struggling with bills and health care. And Bernie Sanders represents a threat to power. And let's be, and, you know, not just ideologically, like I'm talking consulting contracts. I'm talking if there's a new leadership in the DNC, a handful of political consulting firms are not going to get re-upped contracts in the same way. That's real shit. That's money. That's the biggest thing in the world, right? Look at what happened in Brazil in the last election. It came down to with, I mean, look, and this is, again, people should never forget how important just political skill is. Lula was the victim of years of judicial media warfare, and the polls showed he still led Bolsonaro by 15%. Like, such a big margin, he would have won in the first round because of his record and because of his charisma. When it became Haddad, who's I've met Fernando Haddad, he was a great mayor of Sao Paulo. He put forward a totally respectable, moderate, chill program which any sane person would respond to. Tons of liberals, including the former president, this asshole Cardoso, either wouldn't endorse or campaign for Bolsonaro. And because at the end of the day, a lot of these people are just protecting their capital interests. And I think the best thing you can do is just be really clear about what the power difference is and win. I mean, this is one of the things, you know, that frustrated me about so much of this Warren discourse. It's like they're competing. Beat her, win. Or she beats him and wins. There isn't like this secret, like they're really working together. No, they're competing. And he's competing against networks of insulated people, some of whom are insane, some of whom are stupid, some of whom are like having panics on television, some of whom are cynical and corrupt, some of whom all of the above, some of whom actually probably really want to do some of the things we want to do and just didn't think it was possible. And they're scared. So, you gotta just keep going. But don't feel it's so stacked to the point that you don't do anything, because that's when nothing happens. You know what I mean? Like if you really get to like, well, it's all rigged, it's all I think when you look at propaganda that will come out at Bernie if he is the nominee, the most effective, the big picture like socialism and your grandpa's scared stuff, we'll deal with that. It will work or it won't. But in the margins, like young people turning out, look at stuff, and I don't know whether it's conscious. I'm not Rachel Maddow. I don't think there's a secret, you know, I don't know what Russia is doing. But I do know that publicly Israeli officials, people around Israel, and just today, the head of the BJP party in India, responding to Bernie calling out their horrific human rights abuses, said, we're going to get involved in this election. So I know that these types of things are coming. I know that the whole oligarch class of this country will try to fund propaganda against him. And with young people and people who are quote unquote lower information, which I don't like that phrase because a lot of high information people are low content. But you will see propaganda that will look more like, yeah, Bernie's a nice guy, but nothing's possible. Oh, Bernie talks a good game, but he endorsed Hillary Clinton. It's not going to be the stuff that works on adults. What will do a Joe Rogan audience, which is more representative of mainstream middle opinion than the New York Times editorial by a factor of 1,000,000 to 1, is not he's a socialist or blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter, dude. Whatever. Go out, fucking have fun. It doesn't matter. Yeah, Bernie, whatever. Maybe you like him, maybe you don't. Nothing will change, nothing will happen. So don't worry about it, don't bother. And what bothers me, of course there's bias in the Democratic National Committee. These people are publicly talking about not giving him the nomination if he wins. And I don't care what the rules are, I know what the rules are. Okay, I know what the rules are. By the way, no bigger gift to Donald Trump when after they do that and they lose. Well, this won't even happen because they'll lose. But the Democratic Party talking like that is so empowering of Donald Trump, who absolutely will not accept the results of an election he lost. And all he'll have to say is, well, Democrats, I mean, we don't even know. We got to figure out what's going on. So, but that's all true and we need to fight it. And I actually think Super Tuesday might go quite well and it will shut a lot of people up. But that being said, don't go to a point where you just say like, well, it's rigged, nothing will happen. Because that's actually the most potent propaganda. And I've looked at polls when they talk about, you know, these mobilizing these new voters that are hard to mobilize, and it isn't ideology, and in fact, of course, ideologically, they mostly like Sanders, but the most potent talking point is, yeah, but none of it will make any difference. That's the enemy right there. And cynicism is pseudo-sophistication, so let's not do it.
This is my first time voting, and as Bernie Sanders is like the first candidate I'm ever voting for. Looking forward to elections in the future. I don't really think, I don't really want to make the immoral decision of voting for a corporate candidate. I guess my question is, do you think there will from now on always be a non-corporate candidate in the Democratic Party?
I think that if Bernie Sanders wins, that opens up a lot of political terrain.
Yeah.
I think you got to really look at each thing in and of itself. I don't think voting is a moralistic exercise. So I think you can totally vote in terms of harm reduction, and who you vote for is not a personal reflection of like the content of your character. At the same time, like as an example, Mike Bloomberg, it's one thing to vote for a horrible trash Democrat who is a constellation of a coalition of contradictions versus formally saying in a Bloomberg case, we're done. A Trump versus Bloomberg race means that the Democratic avenues in the small d sense are closed. And I would never vote for Mike Bloomberg, not as a moral exercise, but because I would have to sit back and say, I don't know what the avenue is here to deal with these challenges. Because we're competing in a world between one person who wants us to have an autocracy like Singapore and one person that wants us to run the United States like Batista ran Cuba in the 50s. Look it up. But anyways, I think there's a lot of opportunity for you to vote for people you like. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
I agree with you that Bernie is the best shot and, in my opinion, the best choice. But even so, if Bernie gets elected, it's very obvious that a lot of the CEOs of companies that are committing a bunch of human rights violations, they still have a lot of armor to actually get to them and get them to fix these problems, like the factories in China, labor factories. And
I'm sorry, what do you mean fix problems?
I mean, I guess a good example is how most of like Jeff Bezos or such, they don't really pay taxes or
right.
Stuff like that, or all the human rights violations in China, how they're taking advantage of the labor laws. And I guess my question is just what do you believe is a good route starting from Bernie to really get to solving that issue or those issues?
I mean, global supply chains. I think today on the show I was hosting, got a call from India about, and what people really should be paying attention to this. I mean, this is really, they are, in the words of The Economist, setting up the bureaucratic stages of ethnic cleansing, right? So I'll do the old Noam Chomsky technique where he goes, even The Economist. So, and this guy from India called the show, and he was giving us an update and so on. You know, like a caller, a normal, like not a guest. You know, just called in, was listening online, watching online. And I said, well, what? Like honestly, like what? I get the obvious role, you know, on the media, any kind of platform, you talk about it, whatever. And he's like, when Bernie tweeted about this yesterday, it set off a firestorm in the whole country. Please vote for him. I don't want to reduce everything to that. In fact, I think a lot goes beyond that. These are really complicated problems. And also like even the conversation about China, like, yeah, there's serious rights abuses there and problems, but at the same time, like, what's our strategy when China becomes a genuine peer-to-peer power? And how do we conceive of power? You know, all of this stuff is very complicated. It goes way beyond one cycle. I think that what Bernie does, Michelle Goldberg of all people actually just wrote a piece, and she's, you know, very bearish on Bernie, but she's like, Putin doesn't want Bernie to win. Like, the most terrifying thing in the world for any holder of any type of concentrated power is the idea that a youth-driven multiracial coalition has won power in the world's last remaining superpower. That's unsettling for all of them, right? And look, there's a lot of things that he will try to do as president that no one else has tried to do. He will try to get Amazon to pay his taxes. It's going to be really hard. And a lot of these things are going to spill out to, you know, social, political conflicts in all areas of life. I mean, people don't usually give up what they have freely. And honestly, I mean, in an objective sense, Bernie's campaign is like what he's campaigning on is it's not radical at all. We know that. And in fact, if he didn't have this socialist, I think he is some sort of socialist, but you could very easily just say like, hey, like FDR? You know, like, really? These people are crying about Elizabeth Warren's plans. Her plans are not Bernie's plans, so, you know. But I think Bernie getting elected president is the tip of the spear. That's what I think.
I have this sort of concern that America, in terms of like the sort of politics you see discussed on the news, are sort of like so far right on like compared to like a global scale, that I have this concern of even something so basic as like I might try to go talk to someone and go, you should try to join a union or form a union because you need to be able to have a certain amount of negotiating power, like with your boss. I have this concern that even something like that, someone will go, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like even that kind of level of like sort of class conflict is almost going to be sort of like nonsensical. I don't know if that's actually true.
I don't know if that's actually true either, and I think that there's actually a lot. I think there's actually a paradox with older voters and Bernie too, by the way. Because the most older voters that are just going to be like, socialism, they're voting for Donald Trump, so don't even worry about it. But there's definitely some older voters that will, again, it goes back to the FDR thing. Socialism might freak them out, but then if you say, hey, you remember how you could go to college for free and, you know, for $5 a semester and public works projects and all, and they say, oh yeah, no, we need to do those things. So there's a paradox. But again, when I just go back to the other thing about asking people questions. Because I just think like talking about somebody's situation is what elicits. You're like, oh really? And then your boss, you know, told you had to come in double time and you didn't get paid double time, and then it's almost like, you know what, we need to say no. And it's like, right, it's called a union, you know. But I do think you gotta engage with people where they're at. I'm like a broken record, but you have to. And that's even the thought with the media we do, right? The idea is that hopefully there's some angle. You know, I've definitely at live shows had some people come up to me, they say, well, I liked you because you made fun of Dave Rubin, and now I understand what's happening in Brazil. Or somebody's like, well, I really wanted to just learn more about, you know, African geopolitics. Now I have a system for understanding the world. You know, that's the goal. Find out what people are interested in and what their challenges are, and then subtly propagandize them. Like a Russian.
One thing that Noam Chomsky talks about is how the media's advertising structure makes it such that their audience is predominantly the consumer class.
Right.
So what my question is how do you think the YouTube advertising structure influences your audience type with the Majority Report?
Well, the advertising is not as important. Like my show, my business is built 99% on people being members. The Majority Report's probably like 96%, right? The ads on YouTube, they're there. We get enough views where they make something, but that's not how the business is based. So there's the same themes with Chomsky, but it's a whole other problem set. The problem set is how much does the algorithm and the view count affect your content? When do you start thinking to yourself like, that's kind of dumb, but you know what? That'll get a huge amount of views. I mean, and we all do that, right? Like we all calibrate, and sometimes it's like amazing. Like I did one with Milton Alamati on a really important leader named Thomas Sankara from Burkina Faso, and that one like blew up. And you're like, oh, that's awesome. That's like an amazing piece of content. A lot of people watched it. And then there's other ones where it's just like, look, stuff, I don't do anything that I don't think is good and I don't like, but, yeah, sometimes I'm like, okay, like, Meghan McCain has like a mega tantrum is like, here, and my sit down with somebody who brought, 5 million people out of poverty talking about Iran is here. All right, that's not super encouraging. I think in our world, the audience capture is so direct because you're dealing with like a community, right? Like you're in it. I mean, I've just even started to understand very recently that I have like a thing called like an audience. Like it's just like, hey, yeah, I kind of do this shit on YouTube and podcasts, and there's some people who like it and they pay me for it. Versus like, oh, I guess like this is actually like a thing that is professional and we do, and there's a business, and it's growing a lot. So what's liberatory is that when people pay you directly, you bypass all of these ridiculous filters, and I can design a show that does like Chris Matthews impressions and then does like African history, right? And covers all sorts of things. This professor likes the Chris Matthews impressions. Which one was it? Oh, when he was begging. No, I could just. That's too meta. Years ago, Chris Matthews was literally on television begging Barack Obama to give him an interview. So he would like end his broadcast with like, "Please, Mr. President, please, Barack, look, we've had on Hillary, we've had on the other guests. Please come on my show." Actually, could we put your guys' questions in a Chris Matthews voice? That would be more fun. I was like, is it too much to ask to not have an ancient socialist as my nominee? It's gonna be hard. He's old. He's Jewish. Denmark. All right. So yeah. What'd you say? He's absolutely old and Jewish, to be fair. And then on the other hand, obviously, just as it's liberating, it can get super, what's the line between somebody, like the openness, because, you're not like, in some like arrogant pedestal where someone's like, hey, I've got some feedback, versus like, you actually cannot control the content of my show. Like, sorry, and actually realizing that you do need to have those things. But the bigger challenge for people in independent media, like I think the Noam Chomsky model totally still applies to corporate news and all of that for sure. The big problem for us is that we're building these independent platforms on some of the most concentrated, dangerous mega platforms in the world. I'm not, absolutely not in terms of life experience and fun, and if we're doing well, like recognition and making a little bit of money, absolutely not. But functionally, like as like a function of the economy, we're Uber drivers. Like we're independent contractors working on monopoly platforms that we don't control, that can change instantaneously. So the bigger question becomes, how do we start figuring out, we've got the independent content and the media, but what about the platform? And that's a huge challenge, but that's how we need to think strategically.
I'm not gonna bang on you about the ancient socialist thing anymore, don't worry.
Bernie, I don't want to know, I'm scared. I'm at Lafayette College.
Although, like, you do have to admit, though, if you want Jeff Bezos to pay his taxes, it'd be way easier to do it if you had Democratic control of the legislature.
They won't make it do it.
I'm just saying.
They won't
I'm just saying.
But it's an important point, though, that I'd ask you to really look at. Who does Amazon contribute more money to? I mean, it might be closer to 50-50 now, but historically, more so Democrats. Look, the real choice between Democrats and Republicans, not Bernie, but mainline Democrats, and it's an important choice, I'm not minimizing it, but we have to go beyond this choice if we want to, frankly, survive as a species, when we start bringing ecology into it, is old boy network, white supremacy, monopoly capitalism, or woke monopoly capitalism. Now, I will pick diversity monopoly capitalism any day of the week, of course. But you have to get really clear that when it comes to actually solving these serious problems we're talking about, these, not only are Democrats not going to do it, I mean, look at what the Obama administration, look how they governed Silicon Valley. Take like a really serious look at that. The rise of all of the problems we're talking about are a product of Obama-era decision-making. Period. That's non-debatable. So, and I don't care what people put forward as, what they say in an election year. That is where while I'll say, look, Bernie's more practical and so on than people realize, like, no, it actually matters that this guy has had a clear view of the world that he's right about for decades. And I don't trust.
But they called him the Amendment King in the House or something.
Yeah,
like that. That's how we govern. Yeah,
he did a lot. He was also a mayor, and it was a small town, but bigger than South Bend. But that is being a mayor is actually, to me, like the ultimate test of like the practical components of politics.
So I'm really glad you're supporting Pete Buttigieg then.
Well, what I meant by no is no, because my measure of success is not firing the first black police chief.
Sure. To get to the question, first of all,
please.
I would like to say I'm all about getting Dave Rubin to come on Sam Cedars' show. I don't know if that campaign is still going on, but when I was watching your show, that was a big thing, and I'm still all about it.
How did the thing become Sam debating him? I was the one who dumped on him first. How did that?
Because I always saw Sam on the Majority Report being like, "Come on, Dave Rubin." Because Dave Rubin was like, it's a marketplace of ideas. Or whatever.
I remember that exchange. It was, Well, no. What was really funny is just this history. I did a video on Dave Rubin, and this is before I even launched my own show. And I do not title videos, right? And I won't. I can tell part of this, but anyways. The video came out, and the titler put, like, the name was something like, I don't know, like Michael, like, Dave Rubin is breathtakingly stupid or something like that. Like something like, you will not believe. Yeah, you will.
No, of course.
It's like, you will literally not believe how stupid Dave Rubin is or something. And so, Dave Rubin he used to do this all the time. And actually, to answer your question, I just, like, it's done. Like, Dave Rubin is at the Blaze now. Like, there was like an actual purpose in exposing his bullshit for a while, which is like his whole thing was like, I'm not an ultra conservative, which ideas. And now it's like everybody's kind of like, all right, dude, whatever.
Well, it's funny,
but the way it happened was that Sam slid into one of those like, oh, I'd be happy to debate, with like Sam's fake, positive intention. He would put Dave Rubin in a coma if they debated. And so Rubin had the out, which was the name of my video. And so we did a whole, like Sam was like, oh, I apologize. I'm taking that down immediately. Horrible ad hominem. Ready to debate. So anyway, it was pretty funny. Yeah.
Is the alpha male one? Yeah.
That's the best.
That's my favorite.
Dave Rubin was interviewing Larry. I haven't done a Dave Rubin segment for a minute. Dave Rubin was interviewing Larry King, and Larry King takes a call from his son in the middle of the phone of the interview and starts talking about baseball trades. And it's, wow.
When I tell you
it's one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life.
When I tell you that Professor Van Dyke has been referencing that video once a day since you have released that video, that'd be an understatement. That would be an understatement.
It's amazing.
But anyway, the question.
Yes.
So, I'm sure you have your issues with Tom Steyer running in the race and attempting to buy it, but it was actually.
No, I don't. He's helping us in South Carolina. I love
Well, right,
Keep
because he's
going,
splitting the vote.
Keep going, guy.
But what I actually find Tom Steyer very interesting because he is this, he's this, dichotomy, right? He's this hedge fund billionaire who is, for a wealth tax, and he's for reparations, and he's for all of these, he's for these material gains and he's even more lefty on some things than Bernie Sanders, including reparations, especially economically speaking.
Well, he's definitely, that is, okay. All right. I don't agree with that, but finish your question.
Well, I mean, obviously, on average, but irrespective, you understand the point that I'm trying to make.
That he's a liberal hedge fund guy?
Well, no, not that I'm just saying that, would you vote for Tom Steyer is sort of the question I'm getting at, but also what do you think of these, because obviously there's Steyer and then there's Bloomberg, and Steyer is much more on your side of the spectrum than Bloomberg is.
One way of putting it. But this is where, and this is why a kind of socialistic viewpoint drives people nuts. It's really it's about function, not personality. I find Mike Bloomberg, I think it's kind of charming that he's just this horrifying old asshole. I think Trump is hilarious. I think Trump is an amazing campaigner. In terms of, again, I'm not making a moral judgment. But
Right.
Look at how he communicates, how he whips crowds up. So my philosophical, and this really should not be a radical statement at all. Billionaires and democracy are incompatible. That level of wealth concentration and how it affects politics is fundamentally unhealthy. And Tom Steyer is a minor example of that. There is zero, do you think, and I might think, I don't really care about people's resumes that much, but I think you should have some. Okay, do you think that the public school teacher of the year in Pennsylvania should run for president? And would you consider voting for them?
Are you legitimately asking me that
Legitimately
question?
asking you.
For President of the United States, no.
Right. So same reason I would never consider voting for, who the hell is Tom Steyer? What the fuck does he know?
Right.
Nothing. And that's purely a function of social capital. If you go to read Steve Jobs' biography by Walter Isaacson, he says, what should we do about education in this country? And Steve has a bunch of, pablum you'd expect about teachers or whatever, some nonsense. Okay, let's go ask the New Jersey State Public School Teacher of the Year about how Apple should be run as a company. Tom Steyer has no political experience. He has private prison investments. He built an email list off of whipping up a bunch of idiots to, think we're going to remove Trump through impeachment, which we won't. And yes, he announced the support for reparations 1 week ago at a debate in South Carolina, sure, as a former private prison owner. If Tom Steyer was remotely serious about power and influencing things, he would be funding all of those congressional races you're so concerned about. And there's no, it's just not even as, if we're in a world where the high school teacher of the year is a presidential contender, great, then everybody could be considered. But there's no, money does not have that value to me. And again, I don't just mean that as a moral statement, I mean that as literally, I don't think Steyer's I don't think he's that bright. I don't think he would, be a great president. And I think woke capitalism is actually way more embarrassing. I prefer the actual thing, not the. Tom Steyer, Mike Bloomberg hasn't had somebody tell him he's wrong for decades, and that's quite clear. Tom Steyer does a once a year, he's all right, let's have a rap session. Oh, you're fired. It's embarrassing.
What are your thoughts on a universal basic income?
Yeah. If it's on top of other vital social programs, I would.
Okay.
If it's a substitute, if it is packaged with an openness to actually cutting things, it's a Trojan horse, and I don't like it.
So you'd be anti what Andrew Yang proposes, a freedom dividend?
Andrew Yang people do not like me very much.
Okay.
They send me a lot of.
You're not a friend of the Yang Gang?
Look, I'm a friend of the sentiment. I think, honestly, look, it's great. I like the concept that Andrew Yang came out and said, I'm running a campaign that is about people's material needs, is great.
It's kind of your whole spiel, is your.
No, but I'm talking. Yeah. Well, it's not my whole spiel because listen back to what I talked about with things like Mondragon and Cooperation Jackson. Yes, material needs and also power. Andrew Yang is not talking about giving people power. He's saying, we have an inevitable capitalist process, which also I'm not frankly convinced of. Like the automation stuff is way more contested than he says, way more contested. And then he's like, we're not gonna do anything about it. We're not gonna regulate these industries. We're not gonna take technology and make it beneficial to a broader democracy. We're just gonna let these predator companies do whatever the hell they want. It will spike unemployment, and then in exchange we'll give people a little bit of cash so they don't starve. No, that's not my politics. But if it's on top of a broader set, but I think, like, look, Bernie has a proposal on workers being on corporate boards, which, by the way, again, look at Germany, they do that. Well, it's not common sense in American capitalism, but it's enormously effective and would be infinitely more empowering. Also, if you don't pair that with rent control, people don't like this point, but no one's ever been answered me how that is certainly in urban areas. If that happened in New York, half of that check would just get sucked by a landlord immediately.
Assuming Bernie does win, you've talked a lot about like foreign policy issues.
I'll keep you out of Central Park.
Thanks, I appreciate it. It's okay, I can flee to Canada. It's a good place. But no.
Ooh, I don't know. Have you heard of socialist border protection units? We let them in, but not you out.
Well, I'll flee without my capital. No, but
Just kidding. Go ahead.
So you talk about India and China and Brazil, and the world is kind of a messed up place right now. There's a lot, certainly terrible things going on for a while, but we've got ethnic cleansing in who knows how many countries. And Bernie's been attacked, at least used to be attacked for being isolationist, but he really doesn't seem like that anymore, right? In an interview, he talked about defending Taiwan from China. In a general election against Trump, he'll probably be the interventionist on, like, defending NATO, opposing Russian aggression. And it seems interesting to me because, like, you know, you talked about if you're a foreign tyrant, a socialist seizing control of the last superpower is your worst nightmare. And so it seems like there's a part of the socialist left and of what Bernie says, which I think is a great idea, which would argue if he did win, if he did gain control of the U.S. military and the U.S. Army, you know, you can avoid reckless wars and so on. But he seems to be sketching out a much more aggressive use of U.S. power to protect workers and protect minorities. So because
Well, not, so here's what I'd say. And this is another thing that's going to take major work, because a big problem that the left has, in my opinion, is that for decades, you've had people like Noam Chomsky who, Noam Chomsky's view of U.S. empire and U.S. foreign policy, I agree with completely. I totally agree with 100%. And because, and it's not the left's fault, it's just been so marginalized, it hasn't sketched a view of what it would actually look like when you're in power. That's what, I have a friend, Daniel Bessner, who's at University of Washington, and this is what he's working on, is like, what does it actually look like when you staff up an administration? What does it actually look like when you have a National Security Council that cares about labor unions, as an example? So it's a you know, but it would be a complete rejection of so-called humanitarian interventionism, which is obviously a total failure. And it would, and needs to be, a serious, to the extent that's possible, pullback and cut of the military budget and demanding transparency of the intelligence agent. Like, all of these things that are called, they're not isolationists, they're democratic, are fundamentally important to any durable project, including just even budgetarily. But I think what he's saying and what people around him are saying and people are looking at, like, no, there's still going to be a State Department. So what does that do? State Department that was geared, I mean, the only effective concentration of State Department power we've seen in decades was the Iran deal. It was a pretty good accomplishment, right? Why? I mean, South Asia, I don't agree at all. Like, Richard Holbrooke is not my cup of tea, but his whole upset with the Obama administration is, why is it that you can fund all of these military expeditions in NATO, you know, but you don't give me any backing to try to come up with some type of comprehensive deal in the Afghan, Pakistan, India region and conflict, right? So I think though, to be clear, a lot of the things that we could articulate clearly are still harm reduction, stopping the drone program. Certainly people like me are going to fight to stop trying to foment coups and so on. And again, with like Russia, of course, speak out and criticize this particular policy, but of course we need to get back to trying to do like arms control treaties with them, as an example. And China, yeah, you can criticize, but also China you're going to need to do a hell of a lot of work with. So I think, you know, he's the only one with even the remote sketchings of a map that fits the world we're in. I mean, that's the other thing too, is that it's like you read these other people's plans, and there's always, subjective and objective. And subjective, I don't support humanitarian intervention. I don't like, U.S. empire. I don't like militarism. But I also am looking at it and being like, what world are you living in? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, we are not where you are. This is not the 1990s. So, but I don't think that he would be isolationist in the sense of, we don't care. Like, he called for freeing Lula. He's the only presidential candidate to do that. That is a totally appropriate use of a bullhorn. Should he sanction Brazil? No, right? No, I don't support that. Maybe specific officials, but not the country as a whole. And Elon Omar is actually doing some really interesting work on reforming sanctions.
Okay, because sanctions have been an interesting issue because for the most part they've been imposed in a lot of cases because the argument from the left being they target the country and not the officials. But like, so what's an example of something Sanders the dog likes
That's too
Sanders'
much.
foreign policy?
The dog definitely likes Sanders' foreign policy.
But so what's an
and
example?
Lula. Yeah, sorry.
Go on. What's an example of something that a Sanders administration would do to, like, I don't know, help Muslims in India?
Well, again, the first step is the bully pulpit. I mean, again, I'm telling, like, it actually shocks me. Like, he put out a tweet yesterday, and it caused a riptide. If you're president, you can do that. If you're president, yes, I think we as the left have to oppose, the types of sanctions that you have at Iran and Venezuela right now are literally designed to try to like malnourish people. I mean, we have to oppose that. But of course, I have no problem with if he said, Narendra Modi is not going to travel to the United States. We have a list of people that we know are involved in these pogroms or administering in Kashmir. No, I think he could certainly do things like that. And I also think there's a lot of permission giving and I don't think the world should look like this. I think we should have a multipolar world. But Obama gave Modi permission. Obama normalized Modi on the world stage, sticking with India. When Modi was running for prime minister, he was, in 2005, several years before he became prime minister, he wasn't allowed in the United States under the Bush administration because in 2002, there was a series of mass killings in a state that he governed, which in the most generous scenario, he looked the other way and let happen. And there's many credible allegations that he allowed to happen. And I'm talking about, not to be too gruesome here, but I just really want to say, like, cutting like babies out of women's stomachs shit. When he was running for prime minister in 2014, Barack Obama didn't just say, of course, he's the head of India, we have to have a relationship, it's a major country. They wrote an op-ed together for the Washington Post. He went to India, they feted him, there's a huge business opportunity, there's a strategic, that's capitalist foreign policy. That's the first step. This is how all of these dynamics work. The neoliberal will prioritize capital and doesn't really care about all these issues that they profess to care about. Then he normalizes him, and now under Trump, he sits down with Trump and says, you're a great businessman and the Muslims are dangerous. Great, no problem. So one president that would even at least just say, actually what you're doing in Kashmir is unacceptable to us, and we register that, could motivate forces inside the country to be like, actually, we need to pull back from this. Maybe we can't scrap our constitution.
Well, actually, yeah, I did have another question about what you think the worst outcome of 2020 was, but which Bloomberg, you think?
No, the worst outcome is Trump beats Bernie. That's the worst outcome. Because if Bernie, just on political terrain, if Trump beats one of these other losers, we can just be like, again, we fucking told you so. And of course, there's a massive double standard. Like, if Bernie wins a awe-inspiring historical primary, takes on all of these forces and takes on an incumbent president with a strong economy, and it's close, that's actually an objective, massive accomplishment, and he's recreated American politics, and then all of these people who haven't accomplished anything in decades other than decimating the Democratic Party and increasing income inequality, socialists. So we'll fight on, but that would be my least favorite scenario. Yes.
Yeah. So then, in terms of immigration, I'm just wondering because like Trump was able to kind of co-op a lot of economic populist stuff on trade and again, immigration. Obviously, the way it's implemented, no one can possibly support. But it's kind of exploded the issue on the left as well, and it's kind of undermined, like say, like a Sanders traditional like economic populist or labor position to the point that he's kind of moved on from that. So I'm just kind of curious where, because I've heard you talk about a bit like in terms of short term, just I think you said you'd do two things. You would just grant everyone citizenship immediately and then demilitarize the border. So I guess beyond that, like what sort of policy? Because I mean, I imagine that you're not in favor of like sort of a meritocratic Canadian model or something like that, but kind of that labor position has been kind of eroded.
So I'll get to where I think you're right and where I think it's tricky in a second, but I don't, if you have the frame of the world I have, the issue is always the boss and always capital. It's not fellow workers. So even someone like my buddy Sagar Enjeti on the Hill, quite right wing, will say he doesn't think it will happen and it's not his path. But yes, if you implemented what Bernie said, which is a universal minimum wage for every single worker in this country, documented and not, yes, that would deal with it in a lot of ways. I hope I'm characterizing him correctly. I think I am. But he'll correct me if I'm wrong. But if you're in a situation where you can use surplus labor to drive down wages, your enemy is not the other person laboring. Your enemy is the boss that's fucking your wages. That's it. So my politics around immigration are not just moral, they're material and strategic, because what difference does it make? Like, so maybe there's some, because even today, even with the biggest economic, even with this terrorist white supremacy regime of immigration, is that really helping people's wages? No. Is that really doing anything? And if you implement a quote unquote merit-based system, all you'll do is the people at the floor level are going to be fucked regardless, because the reason they're in a bad position is because of their labor value and how they're compensated in the market, and they don't have labor and governmental protections. If you do a merit-based system, all you're going to do is all of a sudden say like, hey, you thought that an upper middle class job that you thought you had? Sorry. We have people that actually come undercut you. And again, that's a boss issue, not a fellow immigrant issue. So it's actually important to properly diagnose where the problem is coming from strategically. I think that when you actually poll a vast majority of Americans, it's interesting how liberal their views on immigration actually are. They don't support open borders, they don't, and which I'll get to that stuff in a second, but the idea, and I have a friend who's a labor attorney, and it's really interesting, he's like, no, people really do think that if you're undocumented, you can just walk to a post office and fill out some forms and they'll figure it out. They actually think that. They don't understand how brutal the system is. And they certainly don't support kidnapping children, and they don't support this type of thing. And they don't support, what are the racial implications of chain migration? Stuff that's come out about Trump wanting to have immigrants shot at the border. I mean, this stuff is really obscene. And I actually really, not only I think most people don't support it, I certainly think anybody that would consider voting for any kind of Democrat is going to be the type of person that probably wouldn't support such brutality and racism. I think this, though, when it comes to the left, this is another counterculture, subculture thing. And I think it's cool if people want to say that the dream and the vision is ultimately some type of borderless world. That's probably where I'm at in my utopia. But I think going and demanding specific inflammatory rhetoric around there needs to be open borders is just, I think it's just a political disaster. It's totally unnecessary. It's validating group speak over national appeal. And it's also, ironically, to me, very problematic in a context where, in the foreign policy dimension, that indigenous people, or, talk to President Lula, fourth of what he's talking about is getting Brazilian sovereignty respected. And now there's this first world discourse on no borders, man. So I don't like that. And I also think this is another thing, again, I keep trying to distinguish between habit and like social etiquette and principles. If somebody says to me, I believe in borders and therefore I want to be able to kidnap children and have people murdered, okay, we're fighting, that's it. There isn't even anything to talk about. But if somebody says, I want to feel that I live in a country that has a discernible map and some type of broad-based identity that isn't defined along racial or ethnic exclusion, I could say, hey, I have a different vision of the world, but I can't just say that that's wrong. Both because it's not where over 90% of people are at, and also because it's actually really quite arrogant.
I have the sense, I could totally be wrong, but I think like the more kind of provincial, closed-minded, and I don't mean that pejoratively, just temperamentally closed-minded provincial people in this country, including like most of them in the working class, a lot of them don't want a more multicultural country. They do want something that, and in that sense, they do favor something that's kind of racially exclusionary, to use your...
Well, which part were you saying about that? Because I think, well, first of all, I don't...
And those are the people who supported Trump, you know?
Well, again, I don't like that use of the word working class, because the working class is overwhelmingly multiracial. Now, on the other hand, hey, sweetie, that's another mixed thing, because, like, on one hand, the working class is overwhelmingly multiracial, and no, I don't think, I'm being really specific, I do not think most Americans support having children in concentration camps.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, when I say, no, I actually think there is a difference. I think that, and in fact, if you look at the polls amongst African Americans and Hispanics who are citizens, they're not super liberal on immigration. So there absolutely is a constituency of people who pretty definitionally in American context would not define a national identity as racially exclusive, but certainly think that they have a border and da-da-da-da-da. So I think that's the distinction I make.
On certain issues, it seems that the American public generally is pretty apathetic towards certain political issues, and I thought something that was interesting was a couple of weeks ago when Secretary of State Pompeo said to an NPR reporter that no one cares about Ukraine and asked them to find Ukraine on a map. And so I was just curious where, for an issue that is so important, especially for the type of position that the United States has, and considering that, I mean, we will be deciding the direction of foreign policy through the course of this election, how can we motivate the American public to care about these issues that are pretty important, but don't necessarily are seen in like people's everyday lives?
So, two ways. One, I don't mean this as cynically as Pompeo means it, but the truth is most people don't care. And that's just like the truth, right? And frankly, most people, like, people across the world care about the United States because the United States is, you know, affecting their life one way or another. But I don't think most human beings are necessarily territorially, like, scanning the globe, right? So one way of dealing with that is, I do think when we do, you know, media as an example, like, I'll use Lula again. A lot of people got interested in Brazil in my audience because it was a compelling human being with an incredible story that opened the door to U.S. foreign policy history, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other hand, I'm pretty relaxed with, like, I think there's certain issues I want people to be aware of, and this dog is awesome. I want people to be aware of, and I want them to vote on, and I want them to, you know, certainly not be warmongering or xenophobic or bigoted or whatever, but and in the long term, we need to generate an educational system and paradigm because foreign policy does desperately need to be democratized. But people don't need to be specialists in this. And actually, a lot of content that is generated in The Economist or NPR, or, you know, for people who think that they're getting super informed is like a disaster. You know, I mean, it's funny, like this piece that just came out in the Washington Post, you know, confirming that yes, in fact, the OAS put out a totally dishonest report and it was a coup in Bolivia. And it's like, you know, and I was talking to my friend, like, what I would trade for a system of education where somebody just read one book on Latin American economy and US foreign policy, they would know what happened in Bolivia because they have a historical understanding versus somebody who's reading 50 different news articles and this pundit said that and that doesn't give you any information. That's one thing that I try to do in my show. I try to give a context. And paradoxically, I actually think through context is ultimately more interesting than just like a bunch of random bits of information. So, I don't know. I think long term it's a super big challenge because we need to democratize foreign policy, so people need to have a better understanding of it. And, but maybe it's also just, we hope that people have like a positive intention towards our friends in Ukraine or Zanzibar or Jamaica or whatever, but I don't know if necessarily everybody's going to always be up on it. Yeah. But I'll think more about that. I think that's an important question.
Michael, thank you so much for giving us so much of
thank you
your time.
guys.